Finally, I want to know, your remarks about NASA might suggest that you believe the SETI project is actually a search for the intelligent designer.
No, that wasn't what he was implying. It's that you could recognize intelligence without meeting the person who was doing it.
Yes, thank you.
Someone had to send it.
That's right, that someone had to send it. Not necessarily that the designer, not necessarily that the designer of cells sent it, but that somebody intelligent sent it.
Well, it's not without the wrong. It's been argued that life on Earth arose by inoculation from extraterrestrial origins. So it's actually not a football.
Okay. I've forgotten most of the questions, I'm afraid. But I do remember one, and I hope you'll, if you want me to address the other ones, perhaps you can refresh my memory. The one is, how do we disprove intelligent design? Because anything could have been designed. You know, somebody might have arranged this book and stuff purposely just so, you know. Maybe not, but perhaps. I think actually the strong point of intelligent design is that it is falsifiable. For example, if I claimed that some particular system was, required design, purposeful design, and somebody went into their laboratory and took some bacterial strain and mutated it and put it under selection pressure, et cetera, and came up with that system or some analogous system of similar complexity, then my contention that that required intelligent intervention or intelligent design would be nicely falsified. On the other hand, ask yourself, how would you falsify the contention that Darwinian processes produce the bacterial flagellum? What would you do to falsify that? If somebody went into his lab and tried with a non-flagellated species to induce it to come up with a similar system and failed, well, maybe the selective pressures were wrong. If 100 scientists did similar experiments, none of those could rule out Darwinian processes. And so I think the intelligent design is actually has a leg up in that area. You can easily falsify it if you, and as a matter of fact, a number of people have tried to come up with schemes. You know, they denounce my book on the internet and other places every day, and they come up with schemes to try to make a mousetrap step by step, and come up with schemes to explain blood clotting and so on and so forth. If somebody succeeds and better yet does it in the laboratory, there goes the argument. But again, I don't think Darwinian explanations are nearly as vulnerable to falsification.
This discussion has reminded me of a conviction I've had that it's very, very important for Darwinians not to get stuck in particular articulations of their tradition that are committed to step-by-step gradualism or anything like that. And I noticed that some of the people that tried to, like Jerry Coyne, wanted to propose to you, you know, that you don't have to have that hard a model. And when you replied to them, you said, yes, you do. It's got to be gradual and step by step. But at least you see the motives here for these people of trying to loosen that up because they don't want to get caught in this bind.
If I could throw in an example, this is of a recently evolved, we assume, trait, or recently appeared trait. My husband's a pathologist, and one of the real challenges these days is there's a strain of, there are now a number of strains of bacteria that are resistant to the third generation antibiotics. And to have this resistance involves having a plasmid with, I don't remember exactly how many, 8, 10, 12 different genes, some of which are, you know, never before described, but seem to be permutations of previously existing enzymes that have new specificities now, all on a single plasmid, so it can be transmitted pretty quickly. Now, we're assuming that that evolved. I would hope that the intelligent designer didn't put that plasmid into the bacteria so we can't use antibiotics anymore.
From the audience, perhaps from people who have not asked a question yet? If not, I think we have, oh, okay.
Well, 10 or 12 genes have to be there to be antibiotic resistant. And what it looks like is that there was some scrambling and stuff, and eventually a plasmid got all of them.
I'm sorry.
Wouldn't you have to say that your theory is lacking in parsimony in the aesthetic field? Because you're postulating that some biochemical mechanisms evolved through natural selection. Others were produced by design. And when we look at life, we see the injection of these two things. Isn't that a rather unparsimonious theory?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, tell that to a geologist who says that this rock was produced by volcanic action, that rock was produced by sedimentation, this other rock was chipped away by an intelligent designer to make an arrowhead. In explaining the world, you need, you may need more than one explanation. I think it was Albert Einstein who said science should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler.
Yes. There you go. There.
Is that working? Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, it's on.
Sorry. I wanted to see if I could get you to say a little bit more about how you would envision trying to go about confirming a design view. I mean, I think we could agree in the first place that the fact that one might be motivated religiously is neither here nor there. That's a red herring. At one point, you seemed, however, to suggest that one could look at something and just, as it were, know a priori that it had to have a designer. The more careful way, I think, that you formulated that was that design might provide the best explanation, at least that we have currently available for these things. Now, if one then wanted to pursue that line, and it struck me that you seemed to be suggesting that maybe we could let it lie for 100 years when it came to people advocating the hypothesis that there was a designer, though you seemed less ready to allow the Darwinians 100 years of letting it lie before they pursue the matter. I think there is a kind of asymmetry here that I wonder if you could comment on, and that is that it seems to me that Darwinians could, at the very least, say a fair amount about what kinds of experiments one could do or what kinds of evidence one could gather that would actually fill in the holes. They would fill in the holes. It would actually come up with a Darwinian story. What would you do, though, to fill in the holes with respect to a design account? What kind of independent grip could you get on the nature of and the intentions of the designer, specifically vis-a-vis such things as the motor that drives a flagellum or that drives the waving cilia?
Well, I don't know if you can get a grip on the motives and intentions of the designers by a scientific method. And let me just digress a second to say, I think the idea of design is not only a good working hypothesis for science, but it also can be good working hypotheses for philosophers and mathematicians and other disciplines as well. I can't answer, I wouldn't know where to begin to answer things like that, but perhaps Professor Depew and other philosophers would, using their own proper methods, be able to address some of these questions that flow from it. Certainly, as I mentioned before, there are scientific questions one can ask, and one of them is, how much is designed? Just because some things are designed doesn't mean everything is designed in the same way. Another question is, where was the information for all this stored? Could it have been stored in the DNA? Could it have been stored in other cell structures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? None of these are likely to be easily answered questions. And just because one says design doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot of work to be done in the laboratory. I'm interested in protein structure, and there are a lot of ways one can mutate proteins to see what are the critical residues, what the probability is of a certain structure appearing, what is the probability of two proteins getting together, and perhaps with numbers like those, and with other data as well, you can begin to paint a picture of how much can be designed. Can these plasmids, are these plasmids that confer antibiotic resistance that Professor Fulton told us about, are they necessarily designed? Or could they have come about by natural selection? How about things like the DNA replication apparatus, which has dozens of proteins, but many of the systems in that are not irreducibly complex in the same way that, say, the flagellum is. You know, you could address questions like that. So there's lots to be done, not all of it by science, some by other disciplines.
Okay, one more question.
I think so, and certainly other people have I think, proposed things like that. One is Stuart Kaufman and other people who are proponents of something called complexity theory. They think that complex systems can actually organize themselves into functioning wholes. And the only thing I can say is that I will, be happy to look at any evidence for such a thing. Right now, I think the evidence for complexity theory having a role in building structures like we've discussed here is non-existent, really. If somebody comes up with it, we can take a look at it. But right now, such ideas are still too underdeveloped to even consider.
Just two things. I think that if complexity theory, particularly the self-organizing properties of complex systems that can be modeled in computers, have empirical application, it would probably be to thermodynamically driven open systems that have autocatalytic properties and therefore are prebiotic and chemical. What I think of as life and these early pathways of natural selection emerging, this is a guess, not from little bits and pieces of things, but wholes that have chemically autocatalytic properties and that are driven by thermodynamic imperatives. That's that whole tradition of research that Darwinism has so far not encountered. I would like to see a rapprochement between them so that you could get the idea of selection working in accord with that. I think that is the level at which, rather than just monkeying around with computer cellular networks, the kinds of systems that they're trying to apply those to are those kinds of systems. And I think that it might be a really interesting research program. We're going to have to cut this off because we are supposed to be out of here at 5 o'clock. Let me just say that one of the interesting things toward the end of Professor Behe's book is alternative explanations on how something so complex might have come to be on the Earth. And at least one scientist who also is worried about the complexity arising from the mechanism that has been proposed by Darwinism has suggested that, well, aliens sent the first complex things here. And to remind you that next February we'll hear another explanation when our presidential lecturer, who will be Lou Frank from the physics department, will talk about dirty snowballs bombarding the Earth's atmosphere as a possible source of water on the Earth. And he also claims that the dirt on the snowballs could be
the things of which life is derived here on Earth and already in the complex forms that were needed to start the process. So this is not the end of the story for us even this year here in an intellectually stimulating place of the University of Iowa. I want to thank our speakers for today. Please help me thank all of our speakers and hope to see you tonight.